Okay. Okay, so the meeting has begun recording. Thank you for your patience while we sort out the technical difficulties here. So my name is Raul Preciado Mendez. I am the Community Engagement Liaison here at the Department of Environmental Quality for the state of Oregon. Tonight, we will be talking about the Owens Brockway facility in Northeast Portland and going over information related to the Cleaner Air Oregon process, as well as other updates to the facility that are relevant to the community. Sorry about that, 1 second. Okay. Tonight, I'll briefly go over tonight's agenda. So we will provide sort of a welcome and overview of the presentations, as well as do an update on the Cleaner Air Oregon process. We will also have staff who will give updates on our regional Haze program and other DEQ programs. We'll have time for questions and answers, and we'll talk about the next steps for future meetings. So as I said earlier, the meeting is being recorded. You will hear the audio through your computer or by calling in by phone. You're welcome to join in by phone if for whatever reason you have audio issues. Note that by default, you will not be able to speak unless one of the hosts unmutes you, asks you to unmute. So please, when that happens, please feel free to do that in order to be able to be heard. In order to ask a question, please use the raise hand feature. Type your question into the chat. Or if you are on *9 or on your telephone, please dial *9 in order to have your raise hand feature be utilized. If you're having any technical difficulties, please type them into the chat, and Lauren Wertis, who is my co-host, will try and help you out, or will refer you to some other folks to resolve that for you. As I said earlier, we have translation available. So we will be transitioning in slides in both languages simultaneously. Our translator, unfortunately, is having to type instead of talk. So please just talk slowly in order for him to be able to keep up, and speak deliberately as well. We'll have a section at the end of both the Cleaner Air Oregon and Regional Haze sections for questions. At the end of the CAO section, DEQ and Oregon Health Authority staff will answer questions if possible. And if the questions are technical or require additional research, we'll schedule a follow-up meeting for questions we cannot answer today. We will also have a general Q&A about the facility near the end of the meeting. So I'd like to start by introducing the DEQ and OHA staff who are here with us tonight. We have Kenzie Billings, Nina DiConcini, Keith Johnson, Kieran O'Donnell, Raul Preciado Mendez, me, Karen Williams, and Lauren Wertis, who's our co-host. And then for Oregon Health Authority, we have Holly Dixon, David Ferrer, Courtney Fultonier, and Julie Cifuentes. So I will start by introducing our Northwest Regional Administrator for some introductory remarks. So I will go ahead and unmute you now, Nina.
Okay, so just a quick sound check. Can everyone hear me? Thank you. Thank you, Raul, very much for the overview of tonight's proceedings. I want to just I want to welcome everyone to this evening's meeting. I'm sincerely hoping that you are all doing well. I'm so sorry we can't be in person in community with you. It's among the most wonderful neighborhoods to work with. And so I have just a personal sadness about not being able to be with you together tonight. And we also recognize that we're getting into the summer, and with your schedules, this also is an additional challenge for many of you. So we hope that with the recording and being able to have subsequent conversations, that will be an opportunity for you to stay involved with these conversations. As Raul said, I'm Nina DiConcini. I'm the Senior Manager for DEQ, and my role includes oversight of the Portland Metro region geographically, as well as Oregon's North Coast. Before we get started, I'd like to recognize any elected officials or their representatives or members of tribal nations who may be joining us tonight. So you can feel free to unmute or perhaps identify yourself in the chat, and we can give a moment, allow a moment for that for any introductions.
Nina, I believe they're going to need to do it in the chat because only the hosts can unmute. So
okay, so just looking to see. I'll give folks a minute here. If there are any representatives or elected officials or members of tribal governments present. Amy Beth, nice to have you present with us from the Speaker Kotek's office. Thank you. Welcome. And I don't see anyone else. So I think there may be other folks joining us later, but I just wanted to recognize anyone from an elected official's office. We know that the Cully community has had long-standing concerns about emissions from the Owens Brockway plant. And I want to preface what I'm going to share with you and what many DEQ and OHA folks tonight are here to share, that it's a lot of information. And we are going to do our best to segment it so that it can be understood. We're picking up after we left off in mid-April regarding the Cleaner Air Oregon dialogue that we started with Cully for the air toxics risk assessment that Owens Brockway must complete to be in compliance with Cleaner Air Oregon. We also, as Raul said, have several other air quality programs that we want to talk a little bit about that relate to compliance at Owens. One key update I'd like to share is that the facility has committed to discontinue operating Furnace A, and we will discuss how that will change and impact the work we have going forward. The amount of information we have this evening is not likely to be able to fit into this 2-hour block. And toward the end of the meeting, we are going to be talking a little bit about next steps and how we can continue to have conversations with you. Specifically, our partners at the Oregon Health Authority will be on hand to answer and take health-related questions from you, and we want to make sure that you have an opportunity to get those articulated for us so that we can get responses back to you. Before we dive in, I would like to speak directly to an action that DEQ took last Thursday. We issued an enforcement order to the facility, And that order has gained some attention both in the media and in other publications. And perhaps some of you have heard about it. And we imagine that you might have questions about that enforcement action. If you haven't seen any information about it, there's a cover letter and the actual civil penalty that we're going to be adding the link to in the chat. So if you have access to that, we encourage you to take a look at it because it is a great summary of the issues facing the facility. And we want to make sure that you have that as a background for the enforcement, recognizing that it only deals with current permit non-compliance. So it does not address Cleaner Air Oregon. It does not address other things you're going to hear about tonight. So it's only the current permit, the existing air quality permit that the enforcement is about. DEQ can't comment on pending enforcement matters, except to point you to the order and the news release, which thank you very much for posting that, Lauren. We can answer questions about the process if you have them. And Owens does have a right to appeal, and we fully expect them to exercise that right. I am joined this evening by DEQ's enforcement manager. So if at the end you have any questions about the enforcement process, we'll be happy to have Kieran address those questions. And then one last thing you may have heard about is a petition to the Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, which is a federal environmental agency, about permit non-compliance. And DEQ is working in close coordination with EPA regarding the petition. And as soon as information is available to share regarding our decisions associated with that petition, we will be happy to provide that to you. So once again, the enforcement is only about the existing permit. At this time, Owens is not in violation of any Clean Air Oregon violations. And as I think many of you know, this program came into effect in November of 2018, and we are implementing it exactly as we expected to. So with that, we will move to the Clean Air Oregon portion of the meeting, and I will turn the floor over to Kinsey Billings. And again, I would just want to thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thanks, Nina. Okay, as Nina said, my name is Kenzie Billings. I am an environmental engineer, and I'm managing Owens Brockway's Cleaner Air Oregon risk assessment process. Next slide, please, Raul. I'd like to start with a brief overview of how the Cleaner Air Oregon program works. Our program is health-based, which means that facility emissions are required to meet established standards or they need to be controlled. The program has three main parts. First, a facility is called into the program and they're required to report emissions of up to over 600 pollutants in what is called an emissions inventory. And this inventory summarizes both what types of pollutants are emitted to air and how much of those pollutants are emitted. Next, facilities are required to assess risk posed by those emissions to people who live, work, and go to school nearby facilities. This is done by first identifying nearby exposure locations. That would be homes, schools, or places of work. And then second, determining how much of those pollutants are expected to be in air at exposure locations. The final step is to regulate based on the risk that is assessed. Companies are required to act if the levels of air toxics that they emit exceed health risk action levels. Next slide, please. DEQ met with Coley Air Action Team and members of the Coley Neighbors Association on April 13th of this year to discuss Owens Brockway's Cleaner Air Oregon risk assessment progress. And we discussed a few items at that meeting. First, we presented the final approved emissions inventory and information that we had learned as part of that inventory from source testing. In particular, we presented metals emissions data for the facility's glass melting furnaces A and D. And we also asked for your feedback on exposure locations to be used for the facility's dispersion modeling. So that's, again, those nearby community homes, schools, and places of work to complete and approve the facility's modeling protocol. And if you would like to review the slides from that last meeting, they are available at the Owens Brockway facility webpage link that's shown here. And you'll have access to these slides after this meeting as well, so you don't need to quickly write things down at this time. Next slide, please. So we really wanted to say thank you for your input on exposure locations. We asked for your feedback and you provided helpful information on nearby parks, golf courses, daycares, houseless encampments, and you gave us comments on the approach to modeling. Nearby locations that you helped us identify were included in the approved modeling protocol, and risk will be assessed at those locations. Next slide, please. So I'd like to provide a few substantial updates before we review DEQ's preliminary risk estimates for Owens Brockway. Since we met last April, DEQ has met with the facility to discuss expediting their risk assessment. DEQ had concerns based on the emissions data that was presented in the facility's emissions inventory. And all of DEQ's discussions with the facility have occurred after our last public meeting. On April 20th, DEQ met with Owens and learned that Furnace A has been shut down since June of 2020. So you might recognize this picture from our last presentation, and Furnace A is no longer operating. Go ahead and advance the English version, Raul. This means the emissions inventory that DEQ approved earlier this year and the preliminary risk screening numbers that were prepared by the community were produced and based on a scenario that doesn't currently exist. Submittals from the company were confusing in light of this information, but after meeting with the facility, we now have clarity around current site operations. On April 21st, DEQ approved the modeling protocol and risk assessment work plan that we received community feedback on. And on April 22nd, DEQ requested that Owens submit their final risk assessment by May 7th of this year. DEQ had concerns based on the information Owens Brockway had provided, and our timeline requesting submittals by that date reflected those concerns and our sense of urgency to complete the risk assessment. It's important to note that our request for an expedited risk assessment timeline was not legally enforceable. The facility actually has 120 days to submit a final risk assessment after approval of a facility's risk assessment work plan, and that's in accordance with Cleaner Air Oregon rules. Okay, so that happened April 22nd. On April 27th, Owens notified DEQ of its intent to keep Furnace A shut down indefinitely and to modify their Title V permit to remove Furnace A operations from the site moving forward. There's another slide animation in there. On May 10th, DEQ notified Owens that given this new direction of shutting down Furnace A indefinitely, the facility would need to submit a revised emissions inventory, modeling protocol, and risk assessment work plan. DEQ requested that these documents be submitted by May 21st of 2021 with a final risk assessment. And I just want to remind everyone that According to rule, the final risk assessment is due to DEQ 120 days after that original approval. So that would be August 19th of this year. And as of this evening, June 10th, DEQ has not yet received revised submittals for our program to reflect cessation of Furnace A production. Next slide, please. When we met last in April, we presented the numbers on the left side of this table as those that were approved for Owens Brockway's final risk assessment. These numbers characterized emissions of the pollutants listed from the whole facility. So that's including Furnace A emissions. DEQ has not yet received a revised emissions inventory from Owens Brockway, but we did prepare internal estimates of the emissions calculations that we would expect to see if Owens Brockway submits a revised inventory to remove Furnace A operations. Our estimates are in the boxed column on the right-hand side of this table, and they show significantly reduced arsenic and lead annual emissions estimates due to removal of the Furnace A emissions. These revised numbers still rely on site-specific source testing data for the remaining operating furnace, that's Furnace D, and DEQ remains confident in that data. With Furnace A shut down, DEQ is confident that Owens Brockway's emissions and resultant risk are lower than they were estimated to be at our last meeting. Next slide, please. I want to back up a bit to talk about the level 1 screening calculations that community members prepared after our April presentation. Community members calculated and presented risk from a level 1 screening after our last meeting. This method of risk estimation assumes worst case conditions. If a level 1 screening shows low risk, DEQ is confident that risk is indeed low due to those worst case assumptions. There are a few different ways to calculate risk, and DEQ completed its own preliminary risk estimates after our last meeting, and there was a big difference between the results of the communities and DEQ's estimates. We'd like to explain why those are different. We'll look at the graphics shown here for a few slides. On the left is a graphic of furnaces A and D. Remember that Furnace A has 2 stacks. And the level 1 risk screening was completed using emissions data from both furnaces A and D. On the right-hand side of the slide are exposure locations. So that would be homes, parks, schools, and places of work. A level 1 screening assumes that all facility emissions are released from a single point at 5 meters or about 16 feet off the ground. This is very conservative. The facility's actual stack heights are 100 feet and 70 feet. Furnace D's stack is approximately 100 feet tall, which is more than 6 times higher than the height that was used in the level 1 screening. Assuming the stack is shorter than it actually is, means that it indicates pollution will reach the ground closer to the stack. Typically, the higher the stack, the lower the potential risk to immediate neighbors. A level 1 screening also assumes that all exposure locations are 50 meters away or about 160 feet from where emissions are released. If you click one more time on the English version, yep, thank you. And this is conservative, as you'll see on the next slide, because exposure locations in reality are farther away. Next slide, please. So now I want to transition to the information that DEQ used to estimate risk. DEQ identified individual emission points, so we did not assume that emissions were coming from one point source at the site. We identified those emission points by their stack heights, the temperature of gases exiting those stacks. That can impact how gas is dispersed in the air. And we used several other site-specific parameters for our risk estimates. On the left-hand side of this slide, I want to remind folks that furnace A is not currently in operation. Thank you. And Owens indicated that they intend to remove furnace A from their permit. This means emissions numbers and risk estimates that DEQ prepared are lower and likely more representative than what was presented as potential emissions at our last meeting. DEQ also considered local meteorological data, so that's weather data. We looked at local terrain, so that's hills, valleys, and buildings that might affect how pollution moves in the air. And we looked at how emissions are dispersed from individual stacks. We identified the nearest of specific types of exposure locations. You'll see that the nearest exposure locations shown on the right-hand side of the slide are actually over twice the distance from the facility than the distance that was used for the level 1 screening. So remember, that was 160 feet, and you'll see the nearest receptor identified on these slides is about 385 feet away. That also contributes to how the level 1 screening depicts a worst case scenario. If you think about blowing a dandelion flower, the seeds blow farther apart as they float farther away from the person who blew on the flower. Exposure is expected to be lower at locations that are farther away from the facility. Next slide, please. So I'd like to talk about what comes next for cleaner air. Owens Brockway needs to submit their final risk assessment. It is due to DEQ no later than August 19th of 2021. Previous risk estimates were based on information that is not currently representative of facility operations. DEQ's preliminary risk estimates using that old information had us concerned that the facility might be above the immediate curtailment risk action level shown here. That is why we asked the facility to expedite their risk assessment. With more refined information, including the shutdown of furnace A, that risk estimate is lower. We predict, based on our updated estimates, that the facility will need to act to reduce risk. Risk estimates showed that the primary pollutant driving facility risk was arsenic emissions from furnace D. It is important to note that calculated risk is from arsenic that is deposited in soil and not from inhalation risk. In addition, it is due to chronic exposure, not short-term exposure. Next slide, please. Again, the facility must submit their risk assessment for our review by August 19th, 2021. And the outcome of that risk assessment determines what next actions are necessary. Actions to reduce emissions under Cleaner Air Oregon must be initiated because of the outcome of the risk assessment a facility is required to complete. DEQ cannot take action under Cleaner Air Oregon based on our internal preliminary estimates. Action is taken on the risk assessment results that a facility submits and are approved by the agency. Next slide, please. So, preliminary takeaways from all of this are Owens Brockway needs to submit a full risk assessment to finalize their risk assessment result and move to any necessary next steps. According to rule, that report is due August 19th, 2021, and DEQ cannot require risk reduction steps or start the risk reduction timeline if necessary until a final risk assessment is submitted, reviewed, and approved. Health risks identified by the primary air pollutants of concern are from long-term exposure to arsenic in soil. So not from inhalation and not from short-term exposure. And I'll turn it back over to Raul. Thank you.
Thank you, Kenzie. Great. So we are going to answer some questions about this section. I see that some questions started coming in through the chat, and I will unmute folks. Actually, I think Lauren will be handling that, but just to reiterate from what I said earlier, there will be some questions that we're able to answer tonight, and some questions that we may not be able to get to because of additional research required for health-related questions. And yes, there's also some questions that I think we're not able to comment on, but I'll have Lauren read the questions aloud, and then I believe, Lauren, you should have the ability to unmute folks who are answering, so feel free to do that, and I can help you with it if you'd like.
Great, thank you. So yeah, if you could help me, this first question is going to be for Kieran, I think. So we have a question, can you explain why the DEQ fine was leveled at this time prior to the facilities submitting their risk assessment? So Kieran can introduce himself as well.
Sure, thanks, Lauren. Can you hear me?
Can.
Okay, so my name is Kieran O'Donnell, and as Raul said, I manage DEQ's Office of Compliance and Enforcement. And in this office, this is where DEQ issues all of its formal enforcement actions, the civil penalties for violations of permit conditions or other applicable laws. So to answer the question about timing and why DEQ issued the fine at this time prior to the source submitting its risk assessment, the answer is that this enforcement order is not related to Cleaner Air Oregon. The Cleaner Air Oregon program is continuing on its track, but the enforcement order was in response to permit violations. So they're separate in that way. And I think one additional point that I'd like to make is that the enforcement order doesn't affect the Cleaner Air Oregon process. Everything that we've heard from Kenzie so far will continue as we also resolve the order. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you. I am not seeing any raised hands or additional questions in the chat. So a reminder to folks to either raise your hand or type your question.
Also a reminder, if you are on the phone, please press *9 in order to raise your hand. I will give it a few moments here before we continue. Just as a reminder, as these questions keep coming in, we will have a section at the end of the presentation for additional questions. So if you realize that you have just the lightning strikes and it hits you while we're doing something else, please feel free to include that in the chat, and we'll have that opportunity to answer questions later on. I'll just give it a few. Oh, Lauren, you're on mute.
All right, we have another question in the chat, looks like for Kieran again. Is Owens Brockway able to contest or appeal the fine? And what response options might DEQ offer?
Thanks, Lauren, and great questions. To answer the first question, yes, Owens has 20 days to appeal the enforcement order by or in writing to DEQ, and what response options might DEQ offer after Owens submits an appeal. It begins a formal process, a formal enforcement process that can result in a settlement, or we can go to a contested case hearing. The goal there to get a final order for the civil penalty and for the installation of controls and other corrective actions.
Thank you, Karen. Oops, sorry. Okay.
All right, and Kieran, one more for you. So could you please talk about what the appeals process looks like? Will there be an opportunity for public participation in the appeals process?
Thanks, Lauren. Another great question. So as I mentioned, the appeals process begins with Owens submitting an appeal in writing to DEQ within 20 days of service of the order. At that point, we will likely sit down with Owens to try and work through some kind of agreement. If that is not possible, we will proceed with a contested case hearing. It's like a trial, and it's DEQ's burden to prove that the alleged violations occurred and that DEQ appropriately assessed a civil penalty. We typically don't put our enforcement orders out on public notice. There's no typical place for the public to get involved in that process. There is, however, a provision in law that does allow for a petition to the agency for party status in that process.
Great, thank you, Kieran. We have a few more questions that are coming your way. So one, I'll do this one first because I think it might be helpful. Someone's asking if we can repeat the violations here on this call. So maybe just sort of in summary, let folks know what the violations were.
Sure, absolutely. That's a great question. So there are a number of alleged violations. The first being that Owens has exceeded its total particulate matter, often referred to just as PM, limit in its Title V permit. The second set of violations has to do with exceedances of the opacity limit in its permit. And then also we've cited Owens for the alleged violation of late reporting of some of those opacity exceedances. If I could, I would actually like to go back to the question about public participation. There is one step in the process potentially for the public to be involved in, and that is there is a possibility on appeal that the order would go to the Environmental Quality Commission for review, and the Environmental Quality Commission would review the decision of a administrative law judge, and the public absolutely can participate in any EQC or Environmental Quality Commission meeting. I do see there's another question in the chat, Lauren. I don't know if you want me to answer that one as well.
Sure. Yeah, there's what dollar amount will likely end up being for Owens Brockway. So I think the question is, what will the total fine be at the end of this process? And how did we arrive at the $1 million we did fine them? So 2 great questions about how that works.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. So I can certainly talk about the penalty assessment. First, we assess penalties according to Oregon administrative rule. So the EQC has adopted a division of rules that guide DEQ on its penalty assessment. In this case, we assessed roughly $1 million penalty. The exact number is $1,023,054. A large portion of that assessed penalty, nearly $750,000, is calculated by looking at what we call economic benefit. It's another way of looking at the avoided cost of compliance. In this penalty assessment, DEQ is essentially saying that without controls, Owens has avoided a cost of compliance. So that's a big chunk of the total civil penalty assessment. The other roughly $250,000 is what we call a gravity-based penalty assessment. And that is separate from economic benefit, the other portion I just mentioned. So that's a little bit about how we arrived at the figure.
I think that's great.
Okay.
Great. Do we have any more questions in the chat, Lauren?
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay. So I'm going, Kieran, it's still going to be to you. So I'll start with, does DEQ have an estimate for how much the ceramic filters might cost, and maybe put ceramic filters in context for folks, what we're referring to there?
Thanks, Lauren. I do see that in the chat, and I do think that that is probably better answered by our regional Haze folks. There is one question above it, though, that I see in the chat that is definitely penalty related. I'm wondering if I should answer.
Sure, why don't you go first?
Okay.
Okay.
You want me to read it?
Yeah, go right ahead.
Okay. So the question is, if Owens Brockway agrees to do supplemental environmental projects, would DEQ ensure that the neighboring communities receive the benefit of those projects? That is a great question. Supplemental environmental projects, for folks who don't know, are sometimes referred to as SEPs or SEPs. And DEQ does have an SEP policy. What the policy allows is for the payment of civil penalty dollars to a SEP project that has a very specific environmental benefit, instead of those dollars going to the state general fund, which is where most civil penalty dollars go. Our SEP policy does not specifically require the person that receives the penalty to invest those dollars directly into the community that may be affected by their pollution. However, it is DEQ's preference that those dollars do stay local and in the same, what we call, media. So what I mean by that is, if the violation is for air quality violations, we have a preference that the SEP dollars address air pollution. Same with water quality violations and water pollution. So I believe that answers the SEP question. I'm wondering if it makes sense to segue to the next part of the presentation to address regional haze.
Yeah, we can definitely do that, unless Karen, you would prefer to just answer this question first and then start your presentation. It's up to you. I'll let you decide.
Hello, this is Karen Williams speaking. Actually, I am looking for that information. So if I could be given the grace of a little bit of time, I could answer that question at the end of my presentation.
That sounds good. I think that makes a lot of sense. And then just for folks in the chat, if there's other questions that are coming in that you had related to any of the things that we're talking about today, we have a section for Q&A at the end, so we'll have time to address that at that point. Okay, great. So perfect segue here to transition it over to Karen Williams.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Williams, and I am an air quality planner. My job is to understand how various sources of air pollution affect ambient air quality standards in a region. And currently, I'm working on a team that is fulfilling Oregon's requirements to EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, under the Regional Haze program. This program was enacted into the Clean Air Act in 1999, and the program protects visibility in certain wilderness areas. The Regional Haze rule sets long-term requirements to meet natural visibility conditions in these wilderness areas by the year 2064. States have to assess progress toward that goal and report to EPA every 10 years. And it so happens that 2021 is one of those years, and Oregon is required to report progress. If I could have the next slide, please. These two pictures show the difference between a day in the Columbia River Gorge with good visibility and one with poor visibility. And I hope these pictures are helpful to show what we mean when we are talking about visibility impairment. Some facilities emit air pollutants that lead to the formation of particles that impair visibility. These pollutants are nitrogen oxides, particulate matter, and sulfur dioxide. Owens Brockway is one of those facilities that emits those kinds of pollutants. So they are subject to the requirements under the Regional Haze program. Next slide, please. Owens Brockway and other Title V stationary sources in Oregon have been required to report certain information to DEQ after DEQ identified that they are subject to this program, subject to the Regional Haze program through an initial screening process. That initial screening is based on the facility's permitted emissions and the distance of that facility to one of these wilderness areas. The Regional Haze rule requires that facilities that screen into the program must then consider 4 factors that are related to the cost and the feasibility of reducing emissions. And this is called a 4-factor analysis. DEQ has proposed rules to our Environmental Quality Commission, that's our governing body, to consider the rules we're asking the Environmental Quality Commission to consider that describe the regional haze screening process and the 4-factor analysis process. So these are steps that have already been completed. And then the proposed rules also lay out the process by which DEQ would require a facility to reduce its haze forming emissions. Regulated facilities and DEQ may then enter into an agreement through which the facility agrees to lower their emissions or install reasonable pollution controls. If the facility and DEQ do not enter into an agreement, then DEQ would issue an order to that facility to install reasonable pollution controls. Now, in order for DEQ to meet federal requirements of the regional haze rule, DEQ must include those agreements and orders in a final plan that we submit to the Environmental Protection Agency. And those orders and agreements demonstrate that the emission reductions are enforceable. So we are in the midst of this process, and the proposed rules that I just described are now out for public comment. And if I could have the last and final slide, please. We have prepared the public notice of the proposed rules that I just described. And the notice includes the proposed rules themselves, as well as a description of the range of costs that regulated facilities may incur in order to comply with these proposed rules. The public notice period is 30 days long, and DEQ will also hold a public hearing on June 28th. After the public comment period closes, we will respond to those comments and present the proposed rules to the Environmental Quality Commission at the late July meeting. If the EQC adopts the proposed rules, DEQ would then enter agreements or issue orders to facilities by August 9th, 2021. And Owens Brockway is one of the facilities that would be regulated under these proposed regional haze rules if the Environmental Quality Commission adopts them. The reason for the August issuance of the orders and agreements is to allow time for those agreements and orders to be included in the Regional Haze State Implementation Plan, which is abbreviated SIP, when we put that whole plan out for public notice in the fall of 2021. And I will be putting a link to the rulemaking page in the chat for this meeting. And I'll also post a link where you can sign up if you want to be kept informed about this rulemaking. And I will leave it there and try and answer that question and any others about the regional Haze process.
Karen, we're gonna give you some time here, and we're actually gonna go to another question first.
Okay, all right.
That came in through the chat, and then we'll circle back to the question that came in about the ceramic filters.
All right. So the next question we have is for our friend Holly with OHA. And this is from someone living near the plant for 17 years. Are there any medical tests that can determine toxicity levels allegedly emanating from this plant?
Awesome. Can you hear me okay? Okay, awesome. So I'll reiterate where the risk is coming from in terms of Clean Air Oregon and what that preliminary risk estimate was showing us. And then I'll get into the specifics about the question related to medical tests. So from the preliminary estimate that we have from DEQ, we expect that most of that health risk is associated with emissions from Owens Brockway from arsenic that's settling onto soils and building up over time. So the greatest risk coming from there that we're estimating is really coming from consuming homegrown produce and the incidental swallowing of soil that we all do, even though we might not realize it. So that's really where that risk is coming from in these preliminary estimates that we've seen. Although I'll reiterate that Owens Brockway has not submitted the final risk assessment values. So for the question related to testing, so we're not recommending any sort of medical test at this time, but if you're interested in learning more, there's a couple things to note for arsenic testing. So usually with arsenic testing, urine is the preferred sample type to evaluate that, but arsenic is rapidly cleared in the body. So really, if you're testing for arsenic in urine, it's only reflecting recent exposure. So only 2 to 3 days. In addition, arsenic tests can look artificially high if that person ate any fish or seafood within that time period. So different types of arsenic tests are available, but would need to be specific to this situation. So at this time, we're not recommending testing. But just wanted to reiterate that that risk is really coming from arsenic depositing into soil and building up over time and making its way into produce or through incidental ingestion.
Thanks, Holly. We have a question from someone asking about how arsenic naturally occurs in soil. They are asking specifically for DEQ to comment, but since you're talking about it, I think I might let you start, and then if someone from DEQ wants to add on, they can do that.
Yeah, I can get started on that, and then probably someone at DEQ would be better to fill in, but arsenic is naturally occurring from different types of geological, volcanic activity, and urban centers do have high levels of arsenic background. And also arsenic has come from legacy, historical pesticide use as well. So it is a common metal that we find in soils naturally. And maybe someone at DEQ can add on to that.
Yeah, it sounds like Keith Johnson might be able to speak to that. Let me just get him on the line here.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes, okay,
Sorry.
great, thanks. Yes, so related to arsenic and soil, so a couple things maybe just to add on to what Holly said. So many states, and Oregon is one of them, are naturally high in arsenic. And so, and that occurs with many sort of naturally occurring metals, including lead and chrome and others, and mercury as well. So, so that's one factor that we have to take into account to understand that. And different states have sort of different background levels. And as Holly said, there's been a lot of historic arsenic use, whether it's apple orchards in years past, or automobile exhaust or deposition, things like that. So these are all things we sort of have to take into account to establish what's a little bit of a baseline versus what would be an impact from a specific source.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Keith.
All right, so I think I'm going to circle back and get Karen back on talking about regional haze. So Karen, we have the question, what is DEQ's definition of reasonable pollution controls?
Thanks for that question. It's actually, reasonable pollution control is actually defined not by DEQ entirely. The regional haze rule requires that 4 factors be considered in assessing what is a reasonable and feasible pollution control. And those 4 factors, the first is cost. The second is time required to install the control. The third is the life left, the amount of time that that control would last. And the fourth is what is called non-energy, or excuse me, non-air effects of installing that control. And what that really means is, would the control result in higher energy use? Or would the control result in some additional pollution or waste, perhaps if it led to some additional wastewater pollution or something like that? So all of those 4 factors are considered in assessing whether a pollution control is reasonable and feasible. And additionally then, and this is a factor that is in the proposed rules that I referred to, and that is considering the cost per ton of pollution that could be reduced. And DEQ made essentially a policy call that if it costs less than $10,000 per ton of pollutant reduced, then DEQ deemed that to be cost effective and a reasonable pollution control. So those are the essentially 5 factors that are either required to be considered or a policy call that DEQ made in deeming a pollution control to be reasonable.
Great.
And
thank you.
I was just going to say, would you all like me to address the ceramic filter cost question at this time?
Yes, please. And if you can just let folks know about ceramic filters and why that's being asked about in particular.
Thank you. So ceramic filters are one of the pollution controls that were deemed to be reasonable and cost effective. And that was a conclusion that came out of that 4-factor analysis process that I described. And the ceramic filters would control each of those 3 pollutants that I mentioned, the nitrogen oxides, the sulfur dioxides, and the particulate matter. And I will I'm going to refer to some numbers here, but I'm also going to let people know, and I'll put in the chat where you can find the document that I'm actually going to be reading from. And that is on DEQ's website, on the Regional Haze website. And it is the analysis of the pollution controls that that Owens Brockway submitted to DEQ, and that is posted on the Regional Haze website. So just to start with one single number for installing catalytic ceramic filters at Owens Brockway is could be approximately $7 million. So that's just particular to that facility and the controls at that facility. But there are additional calculations and estimates in the document that refer to that cost per ton of pollution reduced. And for each of the 3 pollutants. And I'll just give an example particular to catalytic ceramic filters in reducing the nitrogen oxides particular to furnace D. That would be approximately $3,940 per ton of nitrogen oxide pollution reduced. So I use that as an example because that would be compared to the threshold of $10,000 per ton being deemed reasonable and cost effective. So $3,900 being less than $10,000 per ton, that is just one example of why catalytic ceramic filters were deemed to be cost effective in this particular situation. So I'll stop spouting off numbers now, and I'll type some information into the chat, and happy to circle back around and answer any follow-up questions.
I might hold you for one more question. So following up on the things that go into that definition of reasonable, we have a question about so health impacts, they are not factored into the definition of reasonable. Is that correct?
That is correct. Generally, yes, that is correct. And at the same time, I just wanted to say that the standards, or not really the standards, but the Regional Haze program requirements are to attain natural visibility conditions. So, or to work towards those, or make reasonable progress towards those. So it is not a health-based program. So I just wanted to say that. And at the same time, I mentioned that fourth factor that I referred to as non-air or energy effects. And that having that consideration is not limited only to energy effects. A state can consider what other beneficial effects could come from installing these particular pollution controls. So even though the program is not a health-based program, that does not mean that a state can't consider what are called co-benefits, and that could include health benefits that would come from installing the pollution controls.
Great, thank you for that explanation. That's really helpful. All right, we'll let you type information now. We have another question for Oregon Health Authority. Has OHA done any studies on respiratory illness in children at the 3 public schools near the facility? So over to you, Holly.
Sounds good. So at OHA, we haven't done any studies on respiratory illness in the children at those public schools near the facility that are mentioned in that question. And the challenge with a health study, looking at a health effect that's so common, like respiratory illness, is that that could be from a lot of different things, and it would be hard to attribute it to just a particular source, like an industrial facility. With respiratory illness, it could be related to many different factors, like distance to the interstate, wildfires, wood smoke. So there are a lot of different factors involved. But the Cleaner Air Oregon process with the risk assessment estimation allows us to look at health risk related to a specific facility. So that's the tool that we use in Cleaner Air Oregon.
Great, thank you. I am not seeing additional questions at this time, but we still have time if there are more questions.
While some of those maybe trickle in, we can sort of, well, I guess we'll wait a few minutes for those to trickle in, but I can also talk about the next steps. And then we can also give additional time for folks to ask questions at the end. The next steps are pretty brief. I think something may have come in the chat.
Just we got more links from.
Oh, I see. Great. Thank you. So for next steps, what we want to do, we so far have not received any health-related questions or questions related to CAO that have required sort of additional research that we can't answer tonight. If that does happen throughout this process, we'll take some time to research those technical questions and schedule a meeting that will be announced in the next few weeks. One of the things that will be a factor in determining whether or not we have that meeting will be community interest, the number of questions that we receive, and also how close it is to the public comment period for the Owens Brockway risk assessment that is scheduled to happen around August, I believe. Someone else correct me if I'm wrong, if I have the dates wrong on that. So that timing may make it so it doesn't make sense to schedule a public meeting like a week before that. But it all depends on the questions that we receive tonight, as well as if folks are watching this recorded, you are welcome to send me an email with your questions related to tonight's presentation, and we will address those at whatever sort of public meeting we receive. DEQ will also be posting these presentations on our website. I believe they'll be up tomorrow, along with additional links that we provided in the chat. For folks who joined us by telephone, there will be a video recording of this website as well if you'd like to view it later on our website. So those are just the main next steps. And I'm happy to go back to the question slide, but I think this next one is just saying thank you. But we still have time left on the clock here. So if folks want to keep asking questions, we're happy to do so. And then yeah, that's what we have tonight. So I think what I'll do is I'll maybe give it a couple of minutes so there's not just a super long period of awkward silence, and then and then we'll maybe call it. I'd like to also sincerely thank our translator for being so willing to type up what people said, and for all of the presenters for speaking so slow and deliberately for him as well. So.
There is another question about since arsenic ends up on the ground, what about lead? And does that follow a similar pathway? So I know, Keith, we started with you. I don't know if we want to go back to you as well.
I'm sorry, did you say Keith?
Yes.
Okay.
I would actually defer to our OHA partners because I know that the risk pathways and the impacts from lead and arsenic are definitely different. So I don't know, Dave or Holly, if you wouldn't mind speaking to that.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about lead. So with lead, I'll just reiterate that there are lead emissions coming out from Owens Brockway. We saw that in Kenzie's presentation. But with the DEQ preliminary estimates that were done, it showed that arsenic in soil is driving really all the health risk that was there in those estimates. It was not exposure to lead. And so while it's true that lead can lead to health effects, the air concentrations of lead that are coming from Owens Brockway do not really stand out for lead exposure. We don't have a reason to think that lead risk near Owens is worse than other places in the Portland metro area or other urban centers. But we will look closely at the finalized risk assessments that come out of Cleaner Air Oregon. And I think that's all I want to say. Is there anyone else that wants to add more information on lead in this situation?
Yeah, I think that's great. And I'm not seeing any additional questions. We do have some time if there are more. Check for hands.
I'm actually going to stop screen sharing so I can also review the chat and help folks out here. So I'm going to just close out of this in just a moment. There we go.
And I just put the Cleaner Air Oregon webpage link in the chat one more time so folks have that handy.
Great. I think we'll just give it another couple moments if folks have any other questions, and then if not, we will end the meeting a little bit early. So it looks like I'm not seeing anything come in. Okay. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time tonight. It was a pleasure speaking to you all. If we have contact with some community organizations and other community members who are in this meeting tonight, or maybe who weren't able to make it, and we hear interest for folks to have a follow-up meeting for additional information, we'll send out that information for scheduling within about a week's notice from when we hear back. So it'll take a little bit of time, and you may hear from us basically depending on interest. After that, I think we do have that public comment period coming up. I see Keith turn on his camera, so you might want to say something. No? Okay. Great. Just keeping an eye on the cameras here just to make sure. Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody. And that concludes tonight's meeting.
Bye. Thank you.